There has to be some common sense.
Yes, sir. They have the car stopped at 10th and Ranch Michael by there.
We still don't know who pulled the trigger. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Police Off the Cuff, Real Crime Stories. I'm your host, retired NYPD Sergeant Bill Cannon, a 27-year veteran of the NYPD. We have a really exciting show tonight. And who else but to join me and help me navigate this show but is the great professor, retired NYPD Sergeant, law degree, Mike Geary. And I'm going to bring Mike in next. Mike,
hey, Bill.
Welcome to the show. Good
evening, Billy. Good to see you.
Always good to see you, because I always refer to you as the man of reason, where I'm the more excitable man of not reason, you know. But we also have an unbelievable guest tonight, Bobby Ciccone, retired FBI agent, 27 years in the FBI, a Long Island boy too. West Babylon, grew up 10 minutes from Gilgo Beach. How coincidental is that? Hofstra University Law School graduated. Go Flying Dutchman, although they don't call him that anymore. Other than the Hofstra Pride. I used to love it when they were Hofstra Flying Dutchman. I lived in Levittown, 15 minutes away. The Jets used to practice at Hofstra University, and I used to love it. But Bobby Ciccone, besides being the real life career, is actually way more exciting than his career now. But you guys will probably find his career now more exciting. He's a writer for Criminal Minds, and he's in the Writers Guild of America. And I mean, I know that people love, you know, the fake as opposed to the real, but Bobby Ciccone is the real deal. Bobby, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, sir. Thanks. Nice to meet you. I mean, nice seeing you again. We've met before. Yeah, this is kind of like old home. I was telling you earlier, my dad and brother were both retired NYPD sergeants, and your opening montage there certainly takes me back to my days of, you know, going to precinct picnics and up to police camp in upstate New York, and going in with my dad when he had to pick up his paper check at the station house.
I remember that too. Oh my God. I used to remember even cops, even with my time on the job, they would cash their check at the bodega or at the bar and get this big horse thing full of cash. And I was like, what are you doing?
And the uniform check never quite made it home either.
Never. That's why. And Bobby, I think that's why the expression hairbag came around. You heard it, right? Because they used to say old-time cops would never buy new uniforms, so it looked like hair was growing out of their uniforms, thus the term hairbag. And all cops know that expression. I'm sure a lot of folks in the chat are like, hairbag, what are these guys talking about? Anyway, let's get to the topic at hand today. Bobby, I know you watched this Gilgo Beach case. It's since 2010. This has been on the mind of all people from Long Island, a serial killer out of Gilgo Beach. And when I first heard that they made an arrest, I was like, no way, this is just some TV station making something up so they can get some ratings. And then when I heard it was the real deal, I was like, this is unbelievable. And one of the things that we found out, and we're going to dig into this case a little bit, finishing the warrant on his house and the search of his house, what do you expect that they may have found inside that house?
Well, I mean, the first thing you hope, besides unfortunately human remains, that you hope for, right? You hope for more victims. You know, we had heard that there was possibly, you know, victims in the backyard. Now I understand that might not have happened. But the second thing you look for in a case like this is stuff that ties him to the victims. Some people call them trophies. Some call them souvenirs. You know, there's different words different people use. And quite frankly, different items represent different things to a killer like this. So that's what you're hoping for. You're hoping for a bracelet or, you know, an ID, a driver's license. You know, that's the home run. You know, that's kind of what you're looking for. Something to tie him directly to the victims, in addition to the stuff that kind of we've heard, you know, leaked out a little bit by, you know, different sources about, like, you know, they saw his car or they saw a description of him or whatever. And so what you're really hoping for is something to tie him to. Remember, you have to focus. He's right now charged with 3 homicides. That's what you have to focus on. I know people want to know the bigger picture but he's charged and the clock is ticking. So there are motions on the schedule. You know, there's things that have to be done with respect to these charges, because you have a speedy trial rule. You have things that have to be. So you have to, like, focus on these 3 homicides that he's charged with and get all the evidence you can, and kind of have another team investigating the other possible homicides. But he's charged with crimes right now. There's a clock ticking. There's a motion schedule, and so they have to move forward. So you're hoping that there are definite physical things like a driver's license or a piece of jewelry or something that ties him to one of those 3 victims that he's charged with.
Absolutely. Professor Mike, what is the chances that any actual forensic evidence, i.e. hairs, fibers, blood, anything like that, could be found after 12 years?
Billy, given the, his home and the fact that he seemed to have, the place was like described as a hoarder's home, and he may be a souvenir kind of collector, and the fact that it's indoors and away from the elements, and that there may be places where he put things where no one else would be able to trample on them or find them. Their odds are it may be good that they could find something, because remember, he's smart and stupid at the same time. He's smart because he put the bodies in a place that's really far out of the way, in a dune. They're exposed to the elements. He had the burner phones. He was paying cash for extra minutes. But on the other hand, he was stupid in the fact that he didn't realize how the cell phone technology works when the signal is bouncing off towers and they can triangulate where calls are coming from at different times. I'm hopeful because I just think he is a token collector, and the fact that there may be places in the house where no one would come and say clean, or the wife would clean, or you're just hoping that there's that old carpeting with maybe some sort of, I hate to say it would be graphic, but bodily fluids and things like that. I think the odds are good.
Bobby and Mike, when cops say the house was rather cluttered, it was an absolute shithole, because cops don't use words like cluttered. That house was probably, like you say, a hoarder's paradise. And, you could tell from the outside, this guy had some mental issues. He's an architect, yet he had 2x4s holding his damn house up. Bobby, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, he's all over the place. I think that he lived a very chaotic life. These were chaotic crimes. I think that house inside, I get that, normal houses for us. I mean, when I did gang search warrants in Brooklyn and Queens, I mean, normal houses for us are a mess. So that's a normal house. Like we walk in a house that's a mess, we just call it a normal house. When you start describing something as cluttered, I think you're right. I think that means it was even more of a mess, because everything's like in our perspective, you'd have to be way over the top for it to be considered cluttered. And if he's doing that, there's all the more chance that he's kept stuff that he shouldn't have, that he never thought he'd be caught. And so hopefully, we'll find that they've come up with something to tie him directly to some of these victims. Because once you have that, I mean, how do you explain that away? There's a lot that can be explained away with cell phone records. The defense can muddy the waters with technical jargon and things like that. But if you've got a driver's license or a piece of jewelry that you can put in, onto one of those victims, I mean, that's really hard stuff, how it made its way from wherever the victim was last seen into his house in Massapequa Park. That's a tough explanation.
Absolutely. I don't think many people understand, though, when you saw the amount of evidence they took out of that house, it seemed like never ending. So the job of now collecting it, vouchering it correctly, and cataloging it, photographing it, because guess what? They're going to want to show this to missing persons out there. The families of missing persons. I can't show it to the missing person, to the families of missing persons, and maybe put it out there in the media. Does anyone recognize this piece of jewelry or that? And that, believe it, it's painstaking, but that's how they're going to come across potentially new victims of, because I believe, and I think many people believe, and you said it's important, of course, to concentrate on the 3 that they have him for right now. But I believe he did not start killing when he was 46 years old. So I think this could go back decades. Professor Mike, what do you think?
Billy, probably it would go back, I would think, to the 80s. You got to remember, he's 59 right now. So in the 80s, he was mid-80s, say, 1983. He was, 20 years old in the prime of his life. Yeah, I would think that he's very orderly in the way he disposed of, unfortunately, these 3 girls. And I would imagine that as a younger man with rage against girls and prostitutes, that he killed more. I watched a video on interview with Joel Rifkin, and just in preparation for tonight's show, and he said there's always that urge, and he assumed is very recent, and he assumed that there would be more bodies. So I think if Joel Rifkin believes that there's more bodies, and this has gone on a lot longer than we think, I take Joel Rifkin at his word. I think he pretty much knows what he's talking about.
And Bobby, don't be slanted by, or swayed by the cynical views of guys in the NYPD. What are your feelings as an FBI agent? I think, well, I'm not going to put words in your mouth. Do you feel the same thing that we feel in regards to Rex Heuermann?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, look, the last serial killer case I worked was 2011. I recovered a dismembered 19-year-old victim. She was dismembered and put under a frozen lake in Alaska. And the killer there had started at 17 or 18, and he was 34 when we caught him. And these are crimes of compulsion. Most of them it's psychosexual, and most of it's crimes of compulsion. So these are not emotions that they can harness for any significant length of time. Sure, sometimes months, maybe a year, maybe a little longer, but ultimately these compulsions overtake them again, and they have to kill again. That's and the only thing I will say is that in the cases where we have seen a significant time off, if you will, or a stoppage of, there's a significant life event, there's a death of a wife or something, there's a significant life event that takes place. So I'm sure they've investigated his life and background. If he has no significant life, and it doesn't seem like he has, he's been married, he's been living in this house, he's raised his kids in this house. It seems like he's had a pretty stable lifestyle. If there's been no major life event that caused him to kind of veer off this course, there's no reason for me to believe that this hasn't been happening both, quite frankly, before 2011, 2010, and after, and up until now. So these compulsive crimes, and look, we've seen guys tell us about them. The guys themselves, when they're interviewed, they say they couldn't control it. They could control it for a while. They get some satisfaction over kill, and then that wanes, and then they get, it starts to grow again until they have to go out on the hunt again. And so I think this is stuff of compulsion for him. And I fully expect the Atlantic City, the other parts of the country, them to be investigating where he spent any kind of time, either on work trips or any kind of things like that, to be looking at. I think you're right. I think they'll set up a website. They'll put the jewelry out there. They'll put anything else they have out there that's unidentified, and they'll try to drive people to look at the website and see if they can identify some of this stuff.
Absolutely. Bobby, we had talked a little bit about, and Mike, I'll get to you in a second. I don't want to just favor Bobby because he's FBI and you're NYPD.
It's okay.
we have to have some humor in the show too, Bobby. We talked a little bit about modus operandi and, of course, signature. And he has a very specific modus operandi. He targets sex workers, and his signature, and to oversimplify it, are these green bags, these green sacks that he used to tie them up with, burlap bags, if you will. So that's definitely a signature thing. Would a serial killer, and again, he's accused serial killer, he's arrested, people find fault that I already convicted him. That's what they say, but we're the police, and that's the way we think. All right. So his modus operandi and the signature being the green camouflage burlap bags, would he deviate from that, or is that what he's going to stay with every time?
From doing that. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you froze up for a second. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think he would try to stay to it as much as possible. There are two categories of these things, right? One is him not wanting to be caught, so using a burner-phones, right? That doesn't give him any joy. The burner-phone thing, right? That's just a way of not getting caught, and so he, but at the same time, sex workers have traditionally been a big target of serial killers. But he did it in a specific way. He did what we call outcalls, right? He called the girls on the phone. He didn't cruise up and down a red light district and pick them up on the street, which some serial killers have done. So even, it's even more specific than that. The use of the burner phones, the drawing them to a certain area, and his killing zone where he's comfortable, and so there is more to it than that. And each one of those things he would try to stay as close as possible each time. The other category of stuff is the stuff that gives him the joy, the strangulation, because you're seeing them, the fear in their eyes and things like that. So that stuff they almost always stick to. The stuff the category of stuff that what we call forensic countermeasures, is stuff that they sometimes deviate from if they can't stick to it. So those two categories, they try to stick to as much as possible. They're going to deviate from the first category. And usually that's kind of where they get caught, where they deviate from that first category, which is the forensic countermeasures. And he started making mistakes on the cell phones. He was using them to access websites that were then connected to other parts of his life and stuff. So I don't think they only deviate when it's absolutely necessary or something intercedes and forces them to deviate from it.
So then could he still be a suspect in the other Gilgo Beach murders? Or does the fact that his MO, the MO is they were all sex workers, except believe there was a man dressed as a woman, possible transgender, but then a small a toddler, they said, that could have been probably was with the mother. But because his MO and the signature may not be exactly the same, would that exclude him for that, or would that still include him?
It wouldn't exclude it from me, because these guys, they evolve over time. So if you look at the first killings, if you had a chance to look at all of their killings, the first killings and the last killings would be different. They learn and they evolve, and so they do things differently as they get better at doing this, and they learn. So the criminal element, obviously, we all know criminals are the most evolutionary adaptable elements in our society, and so they learn how the system works, so they evolve. So you might see an evolution of some of those killings. So it wouldn't surprise me. In fact, it would actually be the opposite. It would surprise me if he wasn't tied to some of those other victims, because what are the chances of, in this one stretch of beach, multiple homicide victims from different murders that are unconnected to each other all happen to be buried within a couple of 100 yards of each other? I would find that very, very unlikely.
Absolutely. Professor Mike, throughout history, serial killers have targeted sex workers. Going back to Jack the Ripper in England, he targeted sex workers. Thoughts about that?
Billy, they're the most vulnerable. You've seen them out in the street in Manhattan and in other places where you've worked. In the Bronx and in Manhattan where I worked. They're the girls that have run away. They don't have anybody looking for them. They may not be connected to their family. They might not hear or see their family for months on end. So they may go missing, and the family might not report them because they don't even know that they're missing. They work at night, in the evening, early morning hours, where there's a lot less people around, to see an attack on one of them, or to see a license plate of the person whose car they get into. So therefore, and if it's somebody like a Joel Rifkin, they could it's easier to get away with it that way. They're probably, they're women. They tend to be skinnier, smaller. Many of them are drug addicted and have perhaps narcotic issues. So you can get them high. You might get them drunk. You take them to a secluded place like a motel or a lover's lane, where there's very few prying eyes. Nobody's driving around. They are really, really vulnerable, like the elderly in our society. They're shut-ins. You don't see them too much. So I think that, that's why you do it. It's who's the most vulnerable person. I don't want to if I'm going to rob somebody, I don't want to rob somebody that looks like they're physically capable of taking me on. I want to rob somebody who's very skinny, smaller than me, that I could overpower. I want to do it at a time and a place where there's not a lot of cameras or witnesses around, that sort of thing. And so I think, that's, unfortunately, it's probably the riskiest profession there is to engage in, because you do have these guys occasionally going around and taking advantage of them and raping them and killing them.
Absolutely. I want to play a little bit of this this video, and then we'll comment on it.
Hearing from David Schaller, he says he met with homicide detectives on multiple occasions during the initial years of the investigation. He told detectives then what he repeated again last year, and that led to the arrest of the suspect.
It was a tip about this Chevy Avalanche that led to the arrest of Gilgo Beach serial killer suspect Rex Heuermann. The clue coming from the victim Amber Costello's Long Island roommate at the time. David Schaller telling the Associated Press he spoke with homicide detectives multiple times more than a decade ago when Costello vanished. He was re-interviewed in 2022 and brought it up again. Schaller telling the AP, quote, "I gave them the exact description of the truck and the dude. I mean, come on. Why didn't they use that?" We went to the Brooklyn address listed for Schaller now, but he wasn't available to speak with us Saturday night. Schaller had also told investigators a decade ago that he came face to face with the suspect in the driveway of their West Babylon home, telling the AP, quote, "When they told me she was dead, he was the first person who jumped in my head. I've been picturing his face for 13 years. Suffolk District Attorney Ray Tierney on what Schaller said.
Specifically, the individuals between 6'4" and 6'6", come well over 200 pounds.
Tierney says detectives connected the victim to burner phones back in 2012, but it wasn't until years later that detectives narrowed that to a region of Massapequa Park and cross-referenced it with DMV records. According to vehicle history reports, Heuermann bought the pickup at a Chevy dealer on Long Island in 2002 and transferred ownership to his brother in South Carolina in 2012. Tierney, who became DA in 2022, explains why the tip got buried.
When they're getting that's lost within a sea of other tips and information they're getting. And at the time, there wasn't really any, coherent leadership at the top. There is no interaction between the FBI and the other agencies.
And retired Suffolk Police Detective Rob Trotta, who worked with the FBI, tells me it really was a Suffolk Police Department and District Attorney's Office in crisis more than a decade ago.
I really think this should have been solved, 3 weeks after that body was found. The head of the District Attorney's Office was a guy named Jimmy Burke, who later became the chief of police. We know now that he was a criminal. He went to federal prison. The district attorney at the time is still in federal prison. And I think what happened was, and I know this firsthand because I've talked to retired inspectors and chiefs in the police department, they were unaware that the car was there. They were unaware that there was a 6'4" male as a suspect. They were not being told this.
And tonight, the suspect, Rex Heuermann, remains behind bars in the Suffolk County Jail.
I have so many comments about that. First of all, there was problems with the Suffolk County Police, absolutely, with the guy Burke and with the district attorney's office. But this guy Schaller, they did a rip. He's involved in the sex trade himself. They ripped Rex Heuermann the night before. A typical let's rip the John, don't do the job, take his money and rip him, and we'll get him out of here. And what the rip was that he came into the house and he posed as the boyfriend and said, and acted really, mad that he was going to fight Heuermann. Heuermann took off. Look, I'm not sticking up for the serial killer, but I'm just saying, how good is this information? All of a sudden, he has complete recall 13 years later. I'm having some doubts. I would love to see his rap sheet, first of all. And that, we always vet all of our witnesses that way to see what is his criminal history. I would just love to see that for my own edification. Part two of this, a lot of this stuff is, how accurate were in 2012, 2011 was the cell site hits and the technology to do, to do the cell site hits in Massapequa Park and the one in Manhattan, and then put it together with the suspect. Look, when the task force was put together, 6 weeks after they read this case folder, someone from the state police saw the Chevrolet Avalanche and I think ran a lawman check on it and put it together, and somehow with all, connecting the dots of the cell phone, the burner phone information with the car, with the information they had. And don't forget, they also had DNA information now. They put it all together. And that's how I think over a year ago, Rex Heuermann became a suspect, but certainly not as simple as we're led to believe that it was. And one of the things I really admire about Rodney Harrison is that he's not looking to put blame on people in the past. He's looking to move forward because they have their work cut out for them. Bobby, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, look, I agree with you. I think that they should be looking, they've got work to do here, but I think there's always an opportunity to look back and learn and see if there were mistakes made, what those mistakes were, and how to avoid those mistakes in the future. Now, some of them might not be made again because of, like you said, there was simply technology not available back then that's available now, right? We're hearing, investigative genealogy might have been put to use here as well. So I think there needs to be a focus on, like I said, he's been charged with 3 murders. Let's make sure we get a conviction. Let's handle that case solid. And then all of the other cases we can investigate while he's serving a convicted life sentence. And let's get him locked in. And then let's go back and look at the investigation and see if we can do a hot wash, see if there's any, what mistakes were made, how they were made. And so we can maybe learn from it and not make those mistakes in the future. That's all you can do. But we shouldn't cloud the current investigation with those thoughts. Like I said, I'm sure there are separate investigations now going on in Atlantic City and elsewhere in the country that he might be connected to homicides, but they can't cloud the focus of the investigative team that's taken those 3 homicides to trial, because that clock is running. That train has left the station. The court's filings have been filed and stuff. And so you have to start, hearings, and you have to start testimony and putting evidence into a record, at these hearings. And so I think that I get the public wants to know if mistakes were made, but there's a time and a place for that. I think that's later. Let's look at it. Let's make sure that if mistakes were made, we know how they were made, and we put safeguards in place. But I think that's a different focus, and it shouldn't cloud what the work of this task force has done. I think the former chief of department of the NYPD went out there, constituted that task force as the new police commissioner in Suffolk County, did a great job at putting the right people in the same room together, and they solved this case. Now, why wasn't it solved back then? Well, let's later on, let's go and take a look at that. But I think right now we have to focus on what's right in front of us, and right in front of us is a guy that's been charged with 3 homicides. There's he's going to have court appearances. He's entitled to a speedy trial, and we need to kind of focus on that.
100%. Yeah, Mike, I look at the fact that, according to this guy Schaller, he was interviewed numerous times. If that's true, those interviews should have been on what we would call in the NYPD DD5s or complaint follow-ups, and it should be in the case folder. So to me, it says that there was no oversight. Either those interviews never made it into the case folder, or there was no boss reading the case folder and saying, what's going on with this? Have we found this car? What are we doing with this? Your thoughts, Mike?
Yeah, Billy, I think District Attorney Tierney's right on that interview. He's like, it's a failure of some supervision at the top. And even within the first time when they were investigating these cases in 2010, well before there's any sort of task force, what kind of supervision was provided. But we talked about this a little bit the other day, and I brought up the fact that, it's a missing persons case at the very beginning because it wasn't a homicide investigation. They had not found her body for 6 months. So the first interview he may have had with the detective from Suffolk County was about a missing person. Okay. And maybe he describes at that time a tall guy, a big guy, and maybe he says there's an avalanche. Okay. Her body is found a couple of months later. Now it turns, once you make the ID who it is, now it turns into a homicide investigation. All right. Now you're going to re-interview him. Now remember, he may, as a very cynical New York City, like I would be a very cynical New York City homicide detective, I'd be sitting there going, okay, I'm going to re-interview the guy. And if he starts claiming the same thing about a guy who's 6'6", I'm going to think to myself, wait a minute, is it possible that he is actually the killer? Maybe he killed his girlfriend and he had to report, he made a report to cover his ass back 6 months ago, not thinking her body would ever be found. Remember, the last person to see someone alive is quite often one of the strongest suspects you have. And we do know that sometimes people, do these sorts of things in like a domestic situation. So I'm not so sure that at the time that it occurred, not now looking back, in hindsight, because that's always 2020, but at the time that the detectives were talking to him, that they weren't so sure that his story was actually holding up, and some of it might have been made up. And so therefore, yeah, was there not proper follow-up? I'm sure. But and is that a failure of leadership on the squad level, and not even the task force level, on the squad level, detective squad level? Yeah, I'm sure. But it probably is not due to absolute gross incompetence by every member of the county police, like some critics want to say, or something like that. No, you like Bobby said, you work on this case now, you learn from your mistakes, and then you move on.
Bobby, it's funny, like you said that, because I worked in the detective squad in the NYPD for 16 years, and I was a sergeant for 16 of my 22 years as a sergeant. I was in the detective bureau, and the oversight was unbelievable. I mean, not only did your lieutenant read the case, the captain read the case, the deputy inspector read the case, then it went to the chief of the I'm talking about if it was a big case, they're not going to read every, missing person, every domestic violence case. But it had so much oversight. And then when the DD5 system, because in the NYPD, we were still hitting 2 rocks together to make a spark for the longest time. When the DD5 system went onto the computers, we were like, oh my God, the whole department's going to be able to read it. And it's searchable. Oh my God. We couldn't believe it. What do you mean every detective's getting a computer? We were like shocked because we were using typewriters with carbons. You see, I sound like Crazy Eddie. I'm getting all excited over this, But so the technology now with the DD5 system, everyone was reading the damn case, which was another problem, I think. But, so we was used to so much oversight, and probably that's what Rodney Harrison brought out to Suffolk too, was the amount of supervision and the amount of oversight that, look, it resulted in an arrest. Your thoughts, Bobby?
Yeah, look, I grew up in Suffolk County, and I grew up in the 60s and 70s in Suffolk County, and it was quite rural. I mean, quite frankly, you go out, not now, of course, but in my day when I was growing up, if you go out to the east end of Long Island, it was quite rural. There were farms, and now there's all wineries, and it's trendy. But back then, this was a lot of farmland out there, and so the entire county had. Nassau was a little bit more cosmopolitan, right? It was like the higher upper crust of Long Island, and because it was right next to Queens, and so like it was still, it was still like kind of the stepchild of Nassau County and stuff. And Suffolk County, so we always had that kind of reputation, and so I think you might have had an institutional kind of identity of we're a sleepy little department. This is mostly rural stuff out here. There was no real large cities, in Suffolk County and stuff. And so there was some guys I knew that had transferred from NYPD out to Suffolk, and, then wanted to go back because it was so too slow for them. So I think that you did have some of that was a result of that you had this institutional largesse, this kind of like, we're just a sleepy kind of thing. And, the homicides don't happen here and stuff. And I think when this landed in their lap, I think that, I have to think that the fact that you had a chief of department, NYPD, go out there and take this thing by the neck and shake it loose and put the right people in the room together. I don't think that's coincidence. I think that's a big city police department, the best police department in the world, coming in and going, this is how we approach it. And I think had you had some of those people in this case back then, things might have worked differently.
Absolutely. Bobby, I'd like to point out to the people listening that, yes, Suffolk County was a sleepy little police department that happened to be the second highest paid in New York State. So it was sleepy. They got paid for sleeping.
Well, and look, I grew up there. So, and when I was a young adult there, if I locked my keys in my FBI car, and then called the local police, I had 3 radio cars there in 10 minutes. So, I don't complain about that. They didn't have much to do, but they did show up, when you needed them. But
Your taxes at work, right? I'm going to go to a quick commercial, guys. Folks, this is Police Off the Cuff, real crime stories. If you like real crime, true crime from a police perspective, then you're in the right place. And if you're not subscribed to us, go on our YouTube, hit that subscribe button, give us a thumbs up, and ring that bell. And if you want to contribute to the Police Off the Cuff in a financial way, we have a Patreon with 3 different levels, and we also have a YouTube channel membership with, count them, 5 different levels. And our fans, our subscribers, our friends are on our YouTube channel, and we really appreciate everything they do for us. Jane C., thank you so much for the 1999 super sticker. Very much appreciated, folks. Jane, thank you so much. So getting back to this case, it seems like a lot of people want to dwell on the negative. You get a lot of police people that don't like the police, and they want to dwell on the fact, oh, they should have arrested him 2 weeks after this happened. Okay, let's, like you said, Bobby, let's solve the rest of this case. Let's complete this investigation. Let's see if he's done any more murders anywhere else in this country, and we can assign a team to work on what happened 12 years ago. Why was there no arrest? And look into it. And what is their report going to turn up? We'll find out. But this, in the meantime, we have a serial killer, a alleged serial killer under arrest. Let me play a little bit of D.A. Tierney here.
New York State Police, Suffolk County Sheriff, the Suffolk County Police Department, New York State Police, Suffolk County Sheriff's Office, and FBI, all of whom participated in one way or the other with regard to the search. Other than that, I don't have anything else to say. But I'm more than willing to take questions. Anybody have questions?
Is there any indication that any woman was killed here in the house?
So there's no, I don't believe at this time that we can say one way or the other. Either evidence does not point either one way or the other. I would say that we have obtained a massive amount of material, all of which has to be cataloged and analyzed, and it's going to take quite some time.
So just a quick follow-up. If a victim's DNA turned up on material in the house, would that indicate perhaps that she was killed here?
So I'm not going to talk about what ifs, but with regard to what, if anything, was recovered, it's not like TV. It's going to be a while for the analysts to do their job. Now it goes from here to trace section, and then to if appropriate, the DNA section. So that's a process.
Yesterday, the police commissioner said that the search was fruitful. Can you elaborate on any of the potential evidence taken from here?
I think what he's referring to is the amount of evidence, which is quite a lot, and now it's up to the job of the task force to go through that evidence. And we that's a process, and we need to do that process, but we won't know exactly what we have for quite some time, because just given the sheer volume of evidence that was taken.
One of the other news outlets caught road footage of what looked like burnt bones in the backyard. Could you share anything?
I can tell you that there was ground piercing technology used in the backyard, and specifically there was nothing of note of taken from the backyard as far as remains. There is a whole entire trace analysis that we have to go through with the house with regard to hair fibers, DNA, blood, which we'll just have to await the results on.
The amount of evidence they took out of the house and the voluminous amount of records that'll have to be made from that, as well as, look, I'm not a crime scene guy. I can't even imagine the amount of chemicals they sprayed inside that house to, of course, bring blood, if there were blood on the walls or anywhere else. There's something called amino black they use. I don't even know half the stuff, because you'd have to be really a crime scene guy to know that kind of stuff. But Ed Wallace, who is a first grade detective from the NYPD, and he teaches crime scene techniques all over the world, he seemed to think that there still could be forensic evidence in the house 12 or 13 years later. I mean, it's sort of hard to believe, but Bobby, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it depends on what. First of all, I wish the DA would have used the word material instead of evidence, because when he said all this evidence was taken from the house, material was taken from the house. Whether it's evidence or not is what the process is about. So when he says evidence, people hear that and say, oh, they took about a bunch of evidence out of the house. That's not what they took. They took a bunch of material that they could take because of the warrant, is specified in the warrant. But that doesn't mean everything they took is evidence. The process he then explained of analysis will determine which of that material is actual evidence. So they took voluminous amounts of material out of the house. Not all of that is going to be evidence. That's just the lawyer and me, wanting to make sure.
I was going to say that, but I didn't.
But it's also misleading for people because they hear evidence, all of this evidence, and people on the internet are going, well, they took all this evidence out of the house. Stand back. It's not evidence necessarily. Let's look at what it is. Let them analyze it. Some things have to be sent to a lab to be analyzed. Some things an analyst has to sit down at a desk for hours and analyze it. So I think that let's not call everything they took out of the house evidence. Second thing is, yes, I think there are, depending on what DNA is, if it's a fingernail, if it's a hair fiber, things do, depending on the climatic environment it's in, if it's fairly stable, if it's not open to the elements and stuff, things can last a long time. It can, if it's in a basement, I mean, we've all been in some of those rooms where you move something out of the couch and something looks like it's been there for 10 years. In some of these drug houses in Brooklyn that I used to do warrants in and stuff. And so, I think that there's a chance that DNA does last, depending on what kind of DNA. Is it a bone? Is it a finger? Is it a fingernail? Is it a hair fiber? And then what climate conditions it's been exposed to, humidity, dryness, water, all of those things impact. I was a forensic guy for 19 years, but most of my forensic work was underwater. I ran the FBI's underwater forensic program. And so all of that, that's a whole nother world, and how salt water and fresh water affects evidence differently. So warm water, cold water affects it differently. Moving water, still water. So a lot of the things about where a piece of evidence is, where a piece of material that might contain DNA is, will determine its value and how long it lasts. But I certainly think there can be stuff of value in that house.
Bobby and Mike, you can answer this too. There's been a lot of confusion, and even people that are in the know are confused at this. They got Rex Heuermann's DNA surreptitiously. They were able to get an exemplar from a discarded box of pizza crust that was left inside there. They swabbed the crust. They came across the saliva. Now they have the exemplar. They were asked, does that now go into CODIS? And the answer was, from the District Attorney Tierney, no. CODIS is only for convicted persons. So my question is, and again, people think that everyone should be a genius on DNA, but it's very, very complicated. They have this exemplar. Can they now use that exemplar to compare against other cases legally, or do they now have to get a court order and obtain a new exemplar, say, to compare against a new case? Wow, you guys aren't jumping at this point. I may have stopped the professors.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm as in the dark with DNA as I'm very old school, but with DNA. But I mean, I don't think they have to get in. I mean, they could, they could force him to give, and we've certainly done that before. Force him to give a DNA sample and then compare that to other crime scenes out there where they have an unknown subject. But I don't see them. I could be wrong, but I don't see them being prohibited from using the DNA profile they got off the pizza crust to compare to other cases. I understand why it doesn't go into CODIS, but I don't think that they are prohibited from using that profile and trying to match it up with unknown samples. In other words, so you have, and this is just a hypothetical, you have homicide X happened somewhere else out in the city, even in another city, somewhere else, and you have a victim and you have DNA from somebody. They run that through CODIS, no hit in CODIS. So you have no other prior convicted criminals that belongs to. How they pick and choose which of those kinds of cases. By the way, there are probably thousands of those kind of cases around the country. Now, how they pick and choose, how they take that pizza crust profile and match it to these other cases. I don't know. You do that. Has he spent time there? Was he there working? Those kind of things. Is the MO match? And then you start using that profile against the unknown possible perpetrator profiles in these other cases. I don't see why they would be prohibited from doing that.
So that exemplar, its home right now is some lab. Some lab has that exemplar. So did they become the custodian of Rex Heuermann's DNA? Mike, do you know the answer to that?
Yeah, Billy, right now they are the custodian of the DNA. Just think about it. There may be cases, homicide cases that you've worked on where there's maybe several suspects, and you surreptitiously or voluntarily they give up their DNA. It's not automatically loaded into CODIS. You're looking to see if the DNA that's been surreptitiously given, and I love that word, or taken by consent matches DNA found at a crime scene. If any of those suspects is not charged in the crime, they're private citizens. They have their right to privacy, and you don't want their DNA out there in some sort of in CODIS, especially when they've never been convicted of a crime. So you've got that issue too to look at. But as of right now, yeah, that lab seems to be the custodian of that sample, and until he is actually convicted, if and when he's ever convicted, it could be in the federal system. But until then that happens, then they are the custodians, and it seems to go no farther than that.
Guys, I'm using a lot of law school words, and I never went to law school like you guys, It's guilt through assimilation here, but that's okay, though. What a lot of people were making, and there's a lot of misinformation too, the search of the house. Everyone is making a huge deal out of it, and maybe so, but I don't think it's really in essence part of this case. He had 92 registered handguns, and I don't know the exact number, but over 200 guns overall in a room that allegedly had like a foot or 2 foot thick, depending on who you speak to, concrete, and then he had like a safe type door. I don't think that's unusual for a gun owner to protect their guns in that fashion, especially if they have that amount of guns. But people in the very beginning would say it was the torture room, it was this, it was that. And then that turned out to be like he had a soundproof room. That was all made up. That wasn't true. And in fact, Rodney Harrison cleared that up and said, no, he had a room there he kept all his guns, and it was secured with I think it was like almost like a steel door. So it seemed like he was more concerned with his guns than he was his regular house that had 2x4s holding the roof up, What do you make of that, Bobby, that he had that amount of guns?
I don't know. I know friends of mine. I'm not a gun guy. I've carried a gun my whole life. I grew up in houses with guns. Obviously, my dad's a cop. I have no problem with guns. I have a couple of guns that I use for personal protection and my house protection. But I have friends that are what I would call gun enthusiasts. And some of them live in pretty rural places and have their own firing ranges in their yard. And even some of those guys, I don't even know if they have 200 guns. It seems to me that's a lot of, But the thing is, there's no reason to believe that he was using them to kill people, because I don't think any of the victims were actually shot. So, I don't know what to make of it. I mean, he's a gun enthusiast. I don't know what he was doing. I think some of the investigation will come out with, did he belong to a gun club? Did he go to a range on weekend? I don't know, but it does seem to be excessive to me. But so what? It doesn't mean anything if he's buying them legally and he owned them, legally. That it may be a red herring. I don't know.
Right, it could have absolutely nothing to do with this case whatsoever. There's a question for you from the chat, Bobby.
Mm-hmm.
Lou Lemoracco, thank you for the $10 super sticker. Mr. Chacon, are you telling me that D.A. Tierney and Commissioner Harrison passed the NCABC test? Give one reason why the FBI is not fully in charge of the biggest case this century, please.
Well, homicide is a local crime generally. We do have some federal homicide statutes, and we have some federal serial killer statutes. But this is a case that was properly lodged at the Suffolk County DA's office and the Suffolk County Police Department. The FBI lends its assistance, like the New York State Police did and everything else. And since the FBI was involved. Like we said, since the task force has been put together, everybody's worked great together, and they've had great success. I don't think that, I don't think that the FBI needs to be. I don't think it's the proper place to bring this into federal court. I think this is a state crime right now. When I used to do mafia cases and the mafia would whack somebody as part of a RICO case, those were federal crimes. When I did my gang cases in Brooklyn, we had a statute called murder and aid of racketeering. That's a RICO type crime. So murder is sometimes a federal crime. But here you don't have those kind of connections. This is, I think, properly sitting in the DA's office and at the Suffolk County PD. And I think that the task force, as constituted, brings in all the expertise that they need to get a conviction. Hopefully they'll get a conviction. They certainly, had great success in the year, or a little bit more than a year that the task force has been together. So I think it's a good thing. I think that's where it belongs. I think that in the aftermath of this, the NVAPC, that's where we look at, that's where the FBI lodges all of the crimes of a similar nature. So if somebody, what you were talking about earlier, Bill, about the MOs, that's kind of the MO database, if you will. There's a little bit more to it than that. But that's where if you have somebody that kills people in a particular way, and you had 3 of them happen in Idaho and 2 of them happen in Arizona and 1 happened in Texas, those are the people that put those things together. And so I'm sure that this guy's crimes, as we get more into the analysis of how now, because we're learning more about how he carried out these crimes. And so I think that will be put into that database, and hopefully they will be finding more connections, not only DNA, but through his practice of how he carried out these crimes, because that's what's in that database. That's what the database that was referred to in the question. And so I think that that's going to come. I think that's going to come later as part of the additional investigation, into this guy and into possible homicides outside of the ones we know about the victims that were in Gilgo Beach.
Bobby and Mike, they suggested the same thing in Idaho, with the students, the 4 murders of the students, that the FBI should come in and take the case over. And not only is that a bad policy, because it would really piss off the locals if you did that, but having them come in and help, that's the answer. That's the answer to it, not coming in or even having the state police. Man, could you imagine the bad feelings that would create? Look, I was in Manhattan North Homicide Squad, and when they made this homicide task force, someone very smart made this decision. They said, no, the homicide squad does not catch the homicide. They assist the precinct squad with the case. And that created good feelings rather than the bad feelings it would have created if the homicide squad came in and goes, all right, precinct squad, go back to doing discount arrest and going back to do domestic violence. The big boys are here and we're going to take over. That would create ridiculous amount of hard feelings, in the same way that if the FBI just came in and took over the case, it wouldn't.
And I don't think there's a forum for it. This is not a federal crime, what he's done. I mean, there is a serial killer statute, but it's very limited. And it really is there so that the FBI can come in and give assistance, so we can actually dedicate manpower, and we don't ask for the department, we don't ask for money from the Department of Mutual Aid or anything like that. We can come in because there's a statute, a federal statute that says we can come in, and we can come in and add that assistance, financial resources, whatever it is, and that's what we've done traditionally. And then, look, I came in the FBI in 1987. I worked on NYPD task forces for the 16 years I was in New York. Drug task forces, organized crime task forces. FBI, in my whole history, I've never seen the FBI, quote unquote, go into the local area and take over a case. I've seen a lot of assistance. I've seen a lot of us going in and assisting in everything we can, whatever resources we can bring to bear. If they need us, we're there. If they don't need us, that's fine too. But it's just not. Not only is it not, it really doesn't happen anymore. I think that's a vestige of TV and movies. Every time I see it now as a writer, I see it and I curse the writer who writes that stuff, because it doesn't happen much anymore. If at all. And really, there's no forum. Like the U.S. Attorney's Office, the federal prosecutor, in this case would be the Eastern District of New York and Brooklyn, would have to agree to prosecute this case on a federal level. And it's just not the type of case that would find itself there.
Bobby, you're right. And something, TV sometimes really dictates sometimes reality. Like the TV even suggested, with the student cases, Oh, the FBI, when are they going to take this case off? Where did you get that from, first of all? Who told you to say that? It's so ridiculous. And you're right. But then the same thing, people think that cops have to read Miranda on the scene, because every episode of Law and Order, when they arrest the guy, I cringe when the guy goes, "You have the right." I'm like, "Oh, stop. No one does that."
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, I wrote on Criminal Minds for 4 years. I was in the writer's room. I was a tech advisor. Look, I've, like I said earlier, I have very good friends that are profilers, but FBI profilers don't do 90% of the things that we wrote them doing in that show. They just don't. We don't have a private jet that they fly off to every case they have. They don't go on the G5. We do have a G5. It's a director's plane. The profilers aren't like going out and taking over cases and chasing people down alleys and doing all that stuff. It's mainly an academic pursuit. People don't want to hear that. But people have blown the profiling profession up, and profiling is not allowed in court. I've rarely used it in my career, and so TV does oftentimes mislead the public, and then they apply that misknowledge to real world cases on the internet when they're commenting.
But it's not just TV shows. It's mainly the news. The news really feeds a lot of misinformation out there. I mean, even on this case, they want this case to be about what they didn't do 12 years ago, rather than what they just did 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, if you're willing to indict the police 12 years ago quicker than you're going to indict Rex Heuermann, your mind might be in the wrong place.
Yeah, I think that's true. Mike, what do you think about the possibility, and we're hearing this all the time too, are there 2 Gilgo serial killers?
Billy, I was thinking that, just looking over the timeline, and as I said, I was looking at some information on Joel Rifkin, but I think the oldest case that they have goes back to the late 1990s, involving that child, and I think there was also a victim at Fire Island. So, and I know Joel Rifkin was caught in '93, so his years of killing was like 87 to 93. So I don't think there's a possibility that there were 2 killers, unless I doubt that, unless the analysis is wrong, and maybe one of the skull and the body fragments they found, they've dated it improperly or something like that. But it's probably a really strange coincidence that you would see 2 serial killers, or using the same stretch of land, or possibly that there are a number of killers, single killers, using that piece of land. So I think probably we may never be able to tie it to Heuermann because of the bodies being outdoors and lack of evidence. But I doubt that there was more than one serial killer dumping bodies along that parkway. I don't see it.
And Bobby, you sort of addressed that earlier. You also feel that it's not more than one serial killer.
Yeah, I think the odds of like Professor Greer just said, I think the odds are astronomical that 2 different killers would choose the same land, who are unconnected to each other, and just happen to bury bodies 100 yards less away from each other. I think the odds are astronomical. We have had those kind of things. People win the lottery all the time at these astronomical odds. So it could happen, but it would be, to me, it would really surprise me if number one, he was working with somebody else, because that's been bandied about, or number 2, that not all of these bodies are connected to him. It would really surprise me. But like I said, and like the professor said, I think that some of them, because of their condition and because of everything else, you may never be able to definitively tie him to it, at least not in a court of law. But it would really surprise me if he wasn't the one responsible for each of those bodies out there.
I just want to ask one question, just throw it out there. I know that Police Commissioner Harrison said the family was not involved. They had no idea. They were shocked. And I somewhat buy that. I don't buy into that 100%. And I don't think they had any part in it. But I also want to know, day to day, what was his demeanor toward his family? This guy's a serial killer. He's an animal. how did he treat his family? Now, obviously, I think psychologically he probably destroyed them. And I mean, I can't. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a forensic psychologist. But just knowing about who this guy is at this point, allegedly, we must use that word. He's allegedly the Gilgo Beach serial killer. How did he treat his family? Bobby?
Oh, you want me? Okay. Yeah, no, look, I look, that it happens. And every serial killer case that I know of, it's the same question. And they did have a second, they were very adept at the successful serial killers are adept at hiding that part of their life. And I mean, look, and now we're hearing from his neighbors. This guy was a terrible guy. He was, he was a jerk, and he was the worst neighbor. He didn't really kind of meld in with the rest of us. This is a very suburban neighborhood. Everybody knows each other. You have block parties, you have picnics in the summertime. And he wasn't one of those guys. But every neighborhood has one of those guys. Every neighborhood is the jerk of the neighborhood. The guy who yells at his wife too much. The guy who screams at his kids. That doesn't make every one of those guys a serial killer. They're jerks. They're, I would use stronger language, but they're just people that, people know. And it doesn't mean every one of those guys is a serial killer. Then when you find out they're a serial killer and you reverse engineer it and say, well, shouldn't we have known because he was a jerk and none of the neighbors liked him? Well, if you go into every single neighborhood, I almost guarantee you there'll be somebody that's the weirdo at the end of the block, or that's the bad guy that we always hear screaming at his wife, and she should leave him, and he's a terrible person. But that doesn't mean we think he's a serial killer, right? I mean, it's like, the three things that we always say about serial killers, right? That the profilers tell us, right? It's cruelty to animals, it's a fascination with fire, and it's bedwetting into a later life. It's like into their early teens. Those three things. Almost every serial killer has two of those three things. But that doesn't mean everyone that has experienced those three things become a serial killer. It doesn't work in both directions. It only works in the one direction. So the fact that, you're looking back at this guy now and saying he was a terrible guy and all his neighbors say he was a jerk and stuff, shouldn't somebody have thought about it? No, that doesn't. You have to look at the perspective and the time, and nobody is putting that together.
That doesn't make him a serial killer. Mike, I promised Bobby I'd try to get him off the show in an hour. So I'm going to go to your final thoughts.
Final thoughts for everyone is like we've talked about before, patience. Have patience. This case is going to go on for a long time. The task force is going to be busy for a long time. Don't expect, other than if there was ever going to be a plea bargain rather than a trial, this case is going to go on for at least perhaps a year before you get to the trial stage. So patience for everybody. Don't jump to conclusions about everything you see on YouTube or on the internet. Come here for the actual real lowdown on what's going on in the case. So patience, the watchword. Absolutely.
I just want to say, folks, we always mention the victims because this case is always, and every homicide is about the victims. And the Gilgo Four that we know now, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Bartolome, Amber Lynn Costello, and Megan Waterman. We have them and their families in our thoughts because clearly every case, a homicide case, is about the victims. Bobby, before I let you give your last words, I just want to give you an open invitation to come back at any time. And I would love to have you come back. You're a wealth of knowledge. You're a Long Island boy. You're a Hofstra Law grad. So I would love to invite you back. Final thoughts, Bobby.
Yeah, I mean, people have to start. In my mind, this is two different cases right now. We have the three that he was charged with and the four victims that you put up there. Again, the legal process is moving forward. That train has left the station. We have to focus. There's a team focusing on that. The task force is not doing everything all at once. So there's a team focused on helping those DAs. When's the next hearing? What do we need? Do we need a witness at that hearing? Do we need testimony? Do we need physical evidence to be entered into the record into that hearing? So they are focused on that because once you file the speedy trial and this double jeopardy, so you have to focus on the three that you've charged them with. And I've always said, the day a prosecutor files charges, normally they feel that day they have enough to convict. They're hoping for stuff, but you never hope for a linchpin piece of evidence after you file charges because it may not come. So I think that they felt, and there's always this back and forth between investigators and DAs, and we're usually a little more comfortable going forward with charges before they are. They always want more evidence, and so then you come to that that day where you say, okay, we're comfortable filing charges now on this guy. that day they feel comfortable that they have enough to convict beyond a reasonable doubt in front of a jury, because prosecutors don't file charges and then hope to get the big key piece of evidence. They just don't do that, because we have double jeopardy. Jeopardy is attached in this case, so you can't do that. And so, will they get more evidence? Yes, of course. But they feel confident that they can convict him on those 3 murders and those charges that they filed. Now, hopefully, they will get more evidence, obviously. But then everything else is, to me, secondary. We will not that it won't be investigated or looked at or a lower priority, but there's a different team probably working on those, because the team that's looking at the charges that have been filed has to be very focused on that, because you can't drop the ball in one of these pretrial hearings. There'll be a year or so or more of these hearings, and the prosecution has to be on its game in a case like this. And so I think that in my mind, there's 2 different things going on. Most of that task force is looking at all these other things, and then there's a team that's just focused on the charges that have been filed. They've probably moved some of their offices over into the DA's office already. They have a war room over there. They don't want to be distracted by, a homicide that's in Atlantic City, or what's that about. They want to focus on the charges that have been filed, because, like I said, he's got a right to speedy trial. His lawyers are filing motions. Those motions have to be responded to. The DA is going to turn to the investigators and say, hey, this is the motion, how, we're going to respond, but we need this and that. And so I think that, just like, I think the professor was absolutely right. Patience, let's get him convicted on these 3. And then let's, and at the same time, let's look at what else he's done. But don't lose the sight of the picture that's in front of us. And these are the charges that have been filed against him, with these 4 victims and these 3 murder charges. I think we have to focus on that. We have to get him convicted. That's the first order of business.
Very well said, man. You guys are both professors. I can tell you've spent some time in front of a large lecture hall, because you give great answers. Bobby, retired FBI agent Bobby Chacon, now a member of the Writers Guild for television.
Well, that's right.
So much. Oh, that's right. He's on strike. Solidarity. Luckily, though, you have a pension. Some of these writers don't have any money coming in.
No, I'm not a starving artist. That's for sure.
Hey, Bobby, could you lend me a few thou till the strike's over? And Professor Mike Geary, thank you so much, folks. All you folks that tuned in tonight, thank you so much. Police Off the Cuff, Real Crime Stories. Have a great night, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
One episode just ain't enough.